I want to be a voice actor. No opening preamble this time, let's just get right into it. In the first video, I laid out a plan to develop my skills, create a demo reel, investigate voice acting resources, and then eventually submit auditions. Let's look at that plan. Examine it. Drink it in. Alright, let's forget that plan because I didn't follow it. Drawing on the lessons I learned in the previous Create an Anime opening video, I made another misstep in how I approached this plan. Instead of requiring Section 1, the learning, to do Section 2, the voice work, both can and should, and eventually were, done simultaneously. Unlike my drawing goals, which I abandoned, I do still plan on putting together that demo reel, though this time not for the sake of having a demo reel I can use to apply to roles, at least not yet, but for stretching myself and coming up with voices. The original plan had, unfortunately, put a completely unnecessary blocker in the way. Why should I not, for lack of a better term, start competing in the voice acting marketplace? Just because I don't have a demo reel? It's like saying that you can't play a board game because you don't have a table. If you really want to play the board game, you can just play it on the floor. In the eternal words of actual Cannibal Shia LaBeouf, just do it. What's more impressive to someone looking for someone to do voice work anyway? Someone spending lots of time and energy putting together an example of their best self-created work that may show off their skill but ultimately isn't a reflection of how well they work professionally? Or actual voice work that they've done that has gone out to market? In my professional career, it's usually the latter that gets hired, and I'd hazard a guess that voice acting would likely work under a similar principle. So, keeping that caveat in mind, this is what happened. I started off by simply talking out loud in different voices. A lot. Making breakfast, driving the car, playing with the cat, having a shower. Any time when I didn't need to focus on something, I would talk. Mainly when my honey was out of the house because, unsurprisingly, she found me putting on voices all the time quite annoying. I would say that the first few weeks were actually quite slow in regards to progress. A lot of activity, thinking about different characters, trying out the voices and so on, but not many actual physical deliverables. That is, with the exception of the impressions. Yes, the first goal that I set in the first video. Every week for 10 weeks, I will record a 20-second impression of both Winnie the Pooh and Patrick Warburton. Now, I thought when I wrote that goal that 20 seconds was a long time. No. Very much the opposite. Each recording ended up lasting longer than a minute, often more than 2. And they're bad. Very, very bad. And throughout the recordings, what became painfully obvious very quickly is that, like many impressions, these two also have a trigger word. What is a trigger word? A trigger word is what you say to activate a voice. For Winnie the Pooh, the trigger was, "Oh bother." And for Patrick Warburton, it was, "Hey, Peter." Let's get a cringe-worthy supercut of how many times during practice I had to say those trigger phrases. Alright, let's see if I can get 30 seconds of cringe out of the way. There's nothing else I can do, I just have to accept it. Oh bother, oh bother, oh bother, oh bother. Oh gosh, this is so cringe. Oh, this is agony. I'm sure it's agony to listen to. Oh bother, 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 oh bother. Ah, that actually improved somewhat. Oh bother, oh bother, oh bother, oh bother, oh bother. Okay, that's like nearly 5 minutes of cringe. Alright, I'm done. Oh bother, oh bother. Oh bother, oh bother, oh bother, oh bother. This voice truly is a bother. Oh bother, 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 oh bother. Oh bother, 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 no bother, oh bother, oh bother. Of the two, Winnie the Pooh is actually the harder voice to do. I was starting to get the hang of it pretty well, hitting that weird sweet spot between your chest and your head voice, but there's an odd coarseness to at least the modern Winnie the Pooh voice that I found pretty much impossible to replicate. It's also super impressive that the VA is able to sing in the Winnie the Pooh voice. I've tried and it's very difficult. The voice is already on the in-between of the falsetto and tenor, and that area has a very limited range. In my defense, at the time of writing the script, I'm only 5 weeks after posting the original video, so that means 5 weeks worth of recordings that I am still needing to do. But I'm not sure how I'll figure that out without causing serious damage to my throat. And yes, I did say 5 weeks. I've surprisingly built up a video backlog to a nice and healthy size, so while this video will come out after around 10 weeks after the first video, for me writing the script, it's only been 5. Really, I should have started the recording of the impressions right away, but I digress. Patrick Warburton has his own set of challenges. Not necessarily the actual sound of the voice, but the inflections of it. It's easy enough to do the calm and quiet, "Hey, Peter," but the way that he speaks means that there's all of these really wild jumps in pitch, especially when shouting. It's one of those voices where you think, how on earth did you develop this voice naturally? I'm working on hitting those inflections, but I often end up slipping into what sounds like an unimpressive hybrid of Patrick Warburton and Christopher Walken, so I've still got ways to go. Speaking of goals, how is the other one going? I want to dub over 15 different character-focused clips in 14 weeks. It's surprisingly hard to figure out which clips to dub. I mean, I had a couple of characters in mind, or at least that I wanted to attempt, but what monologue, what conversation? I also came into this planning to stretch myself, not just picking characters in a certain range. Also, just due to the reduction in required effort, I did gravitate towards things that already had an English dub, purely for the fact that the dialogue had already been translated in a way that fit the amount of time a character was speaking for. Funnily enough, easier than finding and dubbing things for myself, submitting auditions for voice work was much easier. I am definitely not a Reddit person. The most I've ever interacted with it prior to working on this voice acting goal was searching for something online and a Reddit post coming up as one of the first search results. However, Amy Smith did mention a couple of subreddits during her talk, mainly r/voiceacting, r/voicework, and r/record this for getting started. I of course checked out all three, but it appeared as though they had developed in the few years since her speech, and free work was less frequent or at least less visible. However, following down a rabbit hole of posts, I did find a link to a smaller subreddit aimed towards voicing things for free, helpfully called Record This for Free, so I looked there for some entry-level stuff. I had some relatively loose criteria about what I was auditioning for. Most obviously, I didn't go for anything where they were looking for a female voice, but beyond that, I looked for these two things. 1. Things that were easy to audition for, stuff that had sample lines that they wanted you to submit, a portion of script, and so on. There were a couple of things that looked potentially interesting, but looked as though they required some sort of back and forth in order to submit something. And number 2, they were clear on the amount of work that would be required if I got the role. There were several things like radio dramas and Dungeons & Dragons podcast type things that sounded interesting on paper, but their descriptions made it seem as though it would be a long-term commitment of nebulous length, or at least it wasn't very clear. Between working full-time, doing my other goals, creating and managing this YouTube channel, as well as things like planning my wedding, which might be a worthwhile video to make, an unpaid long-term commitment wasn't something I could reasonably go for, and I would hate to start something only to let the team down by having to drop out halfway. Aside from those two restrictions, everything else was fair game. For the auditions, I recorded audio of multiple different flavors. Not just to give the requester a feel for my range to better my odds of getting a role, but also to stretch myself and feel out the limits of what delivery I could do. I was actually surprised that the roles that I went for weren't what I thought they would be. A more neutral narrator voice, a more zany, high-pitched affair, a real mixed bag. As I was writing the script, I received my very first polite rejection, which was probably to be expected, but I do find it a tad sardonic that the unlisted video I put up for the audition has more views than any of my actual videos. Har har. As for the other audition, I haven't received any replies yet, but I'll either throw up whether I got accepted on screen now, or I'll record a little insert here. Alright. And then I looked at the other two sites that Amy Smith mentioned, Voice Acting Club and Casting Call Club. Now these two sites are something special. They've got a broad range of things from free roles to paid roles, from amateur to pro. Casting Call Club also lets you submit auditions directly to a role, not to mention that CCC also provides audition options for several other things like singing, editing, audio engineering, and so on. While the subreddits were somewhat of a mixed bag, these two sites are quite consistent, with more detailed and stringent rules for submission of requests. Test lines are often included, and there's generally more details on which roles are available. This made it super easy to pass which roles I was interested in auditioning for, because the standardized format made it clear about time commitments, and audition lines were often a requirement. I'm a bit late finding it to submit auditions before I finish this script though, but I suppose that brings me to what's going to happen before the next video. In regards to the previous goals, I suppose that I'll continue as per usual, and by next video I should have those clips recorded unless I get an even thicker backlog going and end up recording even more weeks in advance of the video being posted. I will add one new goal on top of those. Before the next video, I'm going to submit a minimum of 5 auditions. Definitely achievable, and I imagine that I'll submit more than that, though I've got a couple of busy real-life months ahead, so I won't overpromise. So, one extra goal in tow, and a plan that looks more like this. I guess that's where I'll wrap up for this video. I'm going to once again put a big thank you to Amy Smith. Those years-old notes were still perfectly valid and super useful in finding resources. And in my notes, the resources that I've used for this video were only stage 1 of 3 stages. Though odds are, unless I go a bit more professional, that's likely where I'll be staying for a while. I'll make sure to put all the subreddits and websites in the description so anyone else interested in pursuing voice work can find them. If last video I learned that a goal should be ends focused, this video I definitely learned that I shouldn't arbitrarily stop myself because of self-defined requirements. It's much better to just get in there and start doing things. If you've got any other lessons you think I should be learning, let me know in the comments down below, and if you're interested in seeing what comes next, subscribe to stay notified. After all, it's we attempt new things, not I attempt new things. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a fruitful day.